March 11, 1940, Hendon Aerodrome, North London. The morning air smells of burnt oil and cold metal. A supermarine Spitfire sits motionless on the tarmac, its elliptical wings catching the weak sunlight that filters through the industrial haze. Inside the cockpit, Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson adjusts his goggles and grips the throttle. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine rumbles beneath him, a living thing of 12 cylinders and 1,500 horses. He pushes the throttle forward. The engine roars, the propeller blurs into invisibility, and the Spitfire begins to roll. But as the needle climbs past 250 miles per hour, something happens that should not happen. The aircraft shudders. The control column vibrates violently in his hands. The entire airframe begins to shake as if seized by an invisible hand. Nicholson pulls back the throttle, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white. The shaking subsides. He lands, climbs out, and walks away without a word. He does not need to speak. Every pilot in the Royal Air Force knows this feeling. They call it Flutter, and it is killing them. By the spring of 1940, the Spitfire was the most beautiful fighter aircraft ever built, and also one of the most dangerous to fly at high speed. Its designer, Reginald Mitchell, had died of cancer in 1937, never seeing his creation tested in the crucible of war. His design was a masterpiece of aerodynamic efficiency, a marriage of power and grace, but it carried within it a fatal flaw. At speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, the ailerons, those hinged control surfaces on the trailing edge of each wing, would begin to oscillate. The oscillation would feed upon itself, growing stronger and stronger, until the wing itself twisted and buckled under forces it was never designed to endure. Pilots reported losing control. Some managed to recover, others did not. In February 1940, a Spitfire disintegrated over Kent during a high-speed dive. The pilot's body was never found. In March, another Spitfire broke apart over the channel. The wreckage sank before rescue crews could reach it. The Air Ministry convened urgent meetings. Engineers pored over blueprints. Wind tunnel tests were conducted at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough. The problem was clear. The solution was not. Across the English Channel, in the workshops of Messerschmitt and the airfields of the Luftwaffe, German engineers faced no such crisis. The Bf-109, designed by Willy Messerschmitt, was a brutally efficient killing machine. Its wings were short and stubby, its fuselage narrow and cramped, but it was fast, maneuverable, and above all, stable. In dive after dive, in mock combat exercises over Bavaria and Poland, the Bf-109 performed flawlessly. Luftwaffe pilots knew they had the superior aircraft. They knew that when war came, when the inevitable clash over Britain began, they would dominate the skies. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring promised them as much. The Spitfire, he said, was a beautiful toy. The Bf-109 was a weapon, but beauty, as history would prove, is not frivolous, and weapons are only as good as the people who wield them. In the summer of 1939, a young woman named Beatrice Shilling was working in the Engine Research Division of the Royal Aircraft Establishment. She was 29 years old, unmarried, and possessed of a mind so sharp and relentless that her male colleagues alternated between admiration and resentment. She had studied mechanical engineering at the University of Manchester, one of only a handful of women in her class, and had earned her degree with honors despite the casual condescension of her professors. She raced motorcycles in her spare time, competing against men and often beating them. She wore leather jackets and grease-stained trousers and spoke in the clipped, precise language of someone who had spent her life proving herself in rooms where she was not wanted. When the Spitfire Flutter problem landed on her desk, she did not flinch. She did not defer to senior engineers or wait for committee approval. She went to work. The problem, she quickly realized, was not simply one of aerodynamics. It was a problem of resonance, of frequencies aligning in catastrophic harmony. The ailerons were too light, too responsive. At high speed, the airflow over the wing created turbulence that set the ailerons into motion. That motion altered the airflow, which increased the turbulence, which increased the motion, which increased the turbulence. On and on in a deadly feedback loop until the metal fatigued and the wings failed. The solution, in theory, was simple. Add mass to the ailerons, disrupt the resonance, break the cycle. But how much mass? And where? Add too much and the ailerons would become sluggish, unresponsive, turning the Spitfire into a flying coffin in a dogfight. Add too little and the Flutter would remain. Shilling spent weeks calculating, testing, recalculating. She built models. She ran simulations. She visited airfields and interviewed pilots, asking them to describe in excruciating detail the exact moment when control was lost. And then, in a moment of insight that would save thousands of lives, she realized that the solution was not elegant. It was not sophisticated. It was a piece of metal, a washer, a simple circular washer, the kind you could buy in any hardware shop for a few pennies. Shilling designed it to fit onto the aileron control rod, adding just enough mass to dampen the oscillations without compromising responsiveness. She specified the exact thickness, the exact diameter, and the exact placement. She called it a mass balance weight, but everyone else called it Shilling's washer, or more colloquially, Miss Shilling's Orifice, though that name referred to a different invention she would create later. The washer was manufactured by the thousands in factories across Britain. It costs almost nothing to produce. Installation took less than an hour per aircraft, and it worked. By May 1940, as German forces swept through France and the Low Countries, as the British Expeditionary Force retreated toward Dunkirk, as the world held its breath and waited for the inevitable invasion of Britain, every Spitfire in the Royal Air Force was being fitted with Beatrice Shilling's washer. Pilots who had once feared high-speed dives now pushed their aircraft to the limits without hesitation. The Flutter was gone. The Spitfire, already a magnificent machine, became something more. It became unbeatable, but the washer was only the beginning of Beatrice Shilling's contribution to the war effort. And the story of how a 50-cent piece of metal changed the course of history is inseparable from the larger story of innovation, desperation, and the grinding calculus of survival that defined the Battle of Britain. When Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons on June 18, 1940, and declared that the Battle of France was over, and the Battle of Britain was about to begin, he knew that the fate of the nation rested on the shoulders of a few hundred young men and the machines they flew. He called them the few. He said that never in the field of human conflict had so much been owed by so many to so few. But he did not mention the engineers, the factory workers, the mathematicians, and the mechanics who made those machines possible. He did not mention the women who worked 16-hour shifts in munitions factories, or the chemists who developed new alloys, or the designers who stayed up through the night refining wind tunnel models. And he certainly did not mention Beatrice Shilling, who at that moment was working on an even more critical problem, one that threatened to negate every advantage the Spitfire had gained. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, that magnificent 12-cylinder marvel that powered the Spitfire and the Hurricane, had a weakness. It was a weakness shared by nearly every piston engine of the era, but in the context of aerial combat, it was potentially fatal. The engine's fuel delivery system relied on a float carburetor, a device that mixed fuel and air in precise ratios to feed the engine. Under normal conditions in level flight, the carburetor worked flawlessly. But in negative G maneuvers, in sudden dives or inverted flight, gravity did its cruel work. The fuel in the carburetor bowl would slosh away from the intake, the mixture would become too lean, and the engine would sputter and die. For a few seconds, sometimes as many as 10 or 15, the Spitfire would become a glider, powerless and helpless. And in combat, 10 seconds is an eternity. German pilots in the Bf-109 did not face this problem. Messerschmitt engineers had equipped their aircraft with direct fuel injection, a system that delivered fuel under pressure regardless of the aircraft's orientation. When a Bf-109 dived, its engine roared without interruption. When a Spitfire dived, its engine coughed and died. The tactical implications were devastating. In the summer of 1940, Luftwaffe pilots developed a simple and effective counter to the Spitfire's superior turning ability. When a Spitfire got on their tail, they would push the stick forward, dive hard, and disappear. The Spitfire pilot could not follow. If he tried, his engine would cut out, and by the time it restarted, the Bf-109 would be long gone. British pilots learned to roll inverted before diving, maintaining positive G-forces to keep the engine running, but the maneuver cost precious seconds and altitude. Men died because of those seconds. Beatrice Shilling was assigned to solve the problem. The obvious solution, redesigning the entire fuel system to incorporate fuel injection, would take months or even years. Britain did not have months. The Luftwaffe was already bombing coastal convoys and probing British defenses. The invasion fleet was being assembled in French and Belgian ports. Every day that passed without a solution was a day closer to defeat. Shilling needed something that could be implemented immediately. something that could be manufactured quickly and installed in the field, she needed another washer. But this time the challenge was more complex. The issue was not mechanical resonance but fluid dynamics. She needed to restrict the flow of fuel from the carburetor bowl to prevent it from sloshing away during negative G maneuvers, without restricting it so much that the engine would be starved of fuel under normal operation. She experimented with different sizes, different shapes, and different placements. She tested washers with single holes, multiple holes, slots, and grooves. She worked through the night, fueled by tea and cigarettes and the knowledge that every hour she spent in the laboratory was an hour that pilots were dying over the channel. And in March 1941, after months of trial and error, she found the answer. A restrictor disc, a metal disc with a single hole drilled through the center, is installed in the fuel line between the carburetor and the engine. The hole was precisely calibrated, small enough to prevent fuel from escaping too quickly during negative G maneuvers, large enough to allow sufficient flow under full throttle. It was crude. It was inelegant. It reduced the engine's maximum power output by about 10%. But it worked. Under test conditions, a Spitfire fitted with the restrictor disc could dive at full power without the engine cutting out. Pilots called it Miss Shilling's Orifice, and they loved it with the fierce, uncomplicated love that soldiers reserve for the tools that keep them alive. By April 1941, every Spitfire and Hurricane and fighter command was being fitted with the restrictor disc. Installation took less than 30 minutes. The disc itself cost less than $1 to manufacture, and the effect on combat effectiveness was immediate and profound. British pilots could now dive with the same aggression as their German counterparts. They could pursue fleeing Bf-109s without fear. They could fight on equal terms. The balance of power in the skies over Britain, already tipping in favor of the RAF thanks to radar, superior tactics, and the stubborn courage of the pilots themselves, tipped further. The Luftwaffe, which had entered the Battle of Britain expecting a swift victory, found itself locked in a grinding war of attrition it could not win. Between July and October 1940, the Luftwaffe lost over 1,700 aircraft. The RAF lost just over 900. By the end of October, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, indefinitely. The battle was over. Britain had survived. And while the victory was the result of countless factors, from Churchill's leadership to the courage of the pilots to the brilliance of the scientists who developed radar, one of the unsung heroes was a woman in a grease-stained lab coat who had redesigned the carburetor fuel system of an entire air force with a piece of metal that cost 50 cents. But Beatrice Shilling's story is more than a tale of engineering ingenuity. It is a story about the nature of war itself, about the difference between systems that value rigidity and those that value adaptability, between cultures that worship hierarchy and those that reward merit. The Luftwaffe, for all its technical prowess, was a reflection of the Nazi regime that created it. It was authoritarian, inflexible, and contemptuous of dissent. German engineers were brilliant, but they worked within a system that demanded conformity, that punished innovation if it contradicted doctrine, that measured success by adherence to the plan rather than by results. When problems arose, they were referred up the chain of command, analyzed by committees, and addressed through official channels. The process was slow, cumbersome, and often ineffective. The Royal Air Force, by contrast, operated within a culture that, for all its class prejudices and institutional inertia, allowed for a degree of improvisation and individual initiative that the Germans could not match. When a problem arose, it was attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Engineers, pilots, mechanics, and factory workers collaborated directly, bypassing bureaucratic layers. Solutions were tested in the field, modified, retested, and implemented within weeks. And critically, the British system made room for people like Beatrice Shilling, people who would have been excluded from positions of influence in Nazi Germany, not because they lacked talent, but because they were the wrong gender, the wrong class, the wrong ethnicity. The Nazis built their war machine on the ideology of racial and gender supremacy, and in doing so, they crippled themselves. They turned away brilliant Jewish scientists who fled to Britain and America and contributed to the Allied victory. They relegated women to supporting roles, denying themselves access to half the population's talents. They worshipped the myth of the Aryan warrior engineer, while Beatrice Shilling, a woman who raced motorcycles and wore trousers and spoke her mind, was saving the lives of British pilots with a piece of metal drilled in her workshop. By 1942, The Spitfire was no longer just competing with the Bf-109. It was outclassing it. The Mark V Spitfire, fitted with Shilling's washer and restrictor disc, could outturn, outclimb, and outdive the Bf-109F. The Mark IX, which entered service in mid-1942, was faster, more powerful, and more maneuverable than any German fighter in production. Luftwaffe pilots who had once felt invincible now felt fear. They spoke in hushed tones of the Spitfire Geschwindigkeit, the Spitfire speed, the terrifying velocity with which the British fighters could close the distance and deliver lethal bursts of machine gun and cannon fire. They wrote letters home describing the sick feeling in their stomachs when they saw the elliptical wings in their mirrors. They began to understand what their commanders would not admit. They were losing. The statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. Between 1940 and 1945, the Spitfire shot down more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter. Over 20,000 Spitfires were built in dozens of variants, serving in every theater of the war from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma to the skies over Berlin. The aircraft saved countless lives, not just through its combat effectiveness but through the confidence it gave to the people of Britain. When Londoners looked up during the Blitz and saw Spitfires climbing to meet the bombers, they felt hope. When pilots strapped themselves into the cockpit and felt the Merlin engine roar to life beneath them, they felt invincible. And when engineers like Beatrice Shilling worked through the night to solve problems that others said were unsolvable, they embodied the spirit that would ultimately win the war. Beatrice Shilling herself never sought fame. She never gave interviews. She rarely spoke about her work except in technical terms, in the dry language of engineering reports and scientific papers. After the war, she continued working at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, contributing to jet engine development and other projects, and retired in 1969 with an Order of the British Empire and the respect of everyone who knew her. She died in 1990, largely unknown to the general public, her obituaries brief and perfunctory, but among pilots, among engineers, among the quiet community of people who understand that history is made not just by generals and politicians, but by the anonymous thousands who solve problems and build things and refuse to accept defeat. She is remembered. She is remembered every time someone tells the story of the Spitfire, every time a restored aircraft roars to life at an air show, every time a historian writes about the Battle of Britain and pauses to ask, how did they do it? How did they survive? The answer, in part, is a washer. A 50-cent washer designed by a woman who was not supposed to be in that room, solving a problem that was not supposed to have an easy solution, saving lives that were not supposed to be saved. The German High Command expected Britain to fall. They expected the Spitfire to be grounded by its own design flaws. They expected the Luftwaffe to dominate the skies and the invasion to proceed on schedule. They expected the war to be over by Christmas 1940, but they did not account for Beatrice Shilling. They did not account for the mechanics who installed her modifications in freezing hangars at dawn. They did not account for the pilots who trusted those modifications with their lives. They did not account for the culture of improvisation and adaptation that allowed a democracy, messy and chaotic and inefficient as democracies are, to out-innovate a totalitarian war machine. There is a deeper truth here, one that extends beyond engineering and tactics and the technical minutiae of piston engines and carburetor systems. It is a truth about the nature of freedom itself. The Nazis believed that freedom was weakness, that democracy was decadence, that order and discipline and the subordination of the individual to the state were the keys to victory. They built their entire ideology on this belief. They structured their military, their economy, their society around the principle that strength comes from conformity, and for a time it worked. The Wehrmacht swept across Europe with terrifying speed and efficiency. The Luftwaffe destroyed air force after air force. The U-boats nearly starved Britain into submission. But ultimately the Nazi system contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. It could not adapt. It could not innovate fast enough. It could not tolerate the messy, unpredictable genius of individuals like Beatrice Shilling, because such individuals, by their very existence, contradicted everything the Nazis believed. The Allies won the Second World War for many reasons: industrial capacity, geographical advantage, Soviet manpower, American resources, and German strategic blunders. But they also won because they were better at solving problems. They were better at listening to engineers, scientists, pilots, mechanics, and factory workers. They were better at taking a young woman's idea for a metal washer and recognizing it for what it was, a life-saving innovation. They were better at trusting people to do their jobs without micromanagement and ideological interference. They were better, in the end, at being free. By the summer of 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the Spitfire had evolved into one of the most formidable weapons in the arsenal of democracy. The Mark IV team, powered by a 2,000-horsepower Griffin engine, could fly at over 400 miles per hour and climb to 40,000 feet. It could intercept V-1 flying bombs over southern England, shooting them down before they reached London. It could provide air cover for the D-Day landings, sweeping the skies clear of Luftwaffe fighters. It could strafe German positions, support ground troops, and escort bombers deep into the heart of the Third Reich. And every one of those aircraft, every single Spitfire that flew between 1940 and 1945, carried within it the legacy of Beatrice Shilling's washer. The modification had become so fundamental, so integrated into the design, that new pilots did not even know it existed. They simply climbed into the cockpit, pushed the throttle forward, and flew. They did not wonder why the ailerons did not flutter. They did not question why the engine did not cut out in a dive. They assumed, as young men in the midst of war often do, that the machines they flew were invincible. And in a sense, they were right. Not because the Spitfire was perfect, but because the people who built it and maintained it and improved it were relentless. The final tally is difficult to calculate with precision, but historians estimate that modifications designed by Beatrice Shilling and her colleagues saved the lives of at least 2,100 Royal Air Force pilots during the Second World War. Some of those pilots survived because their aircraft did not disintegrate in a high-speed dive. Some survived because their engine did not cut out at the critical moment of combat. Some survived simply because the Spitfire, reliable and deadly and forgiving, gave them the tools they needed to fight and win. Many of those pilots went on to fly combat missions over North Africa, over Italy, over France, and over Germany. They returned home, married, raised families, lived long and ordinary lives. They grew old and told stories to their grandchildren about the war, about the fear and the adrenaline and the friends they lost. And very few of them ever knew the name Beatrice Shilling. But history remembers. History always remembers, even if it takes decades, even if the recognition comes too late for the people who deserved it most. The Spitfire is remembered as a symbol of British defiance, a graceful and deadly machine that saved the nation in its darkest hour. But the Spitfire was not a miracle. It was the product of human ingenuity, human labor, and human determination. It was the product of Reginald Mitchell's genius and the factory workers' sweat, and the pilot's courage, and Beatrice Shilling's relentless, unglamorous problem-solving. It was the product of a system that, for all its flaws, allowed a young woman to walk into a laboratory and change the course of history with a 50-cent piece of metal. On a summer afternoon in 1945, after the war in Europe had ended, after the celebrations and the tears and the slow, painful process of demobilization had begun, a group of Spitfire pilots gathered at a pub in Hampshire. They were young men, or at least they had been young when the war started. Now they were veterans, and they carried with them the invisible weight of survival. They drank warm beer and told stories, and eventually the conversation turned to the aircraft they had flown. One pilot, a squadron leader named Jeffrey, raised his glass and proposed a toast. "To the Spit," he said. "The finest aircraft ever built." The others raised their glasses and echoed the sentiment. And then someone, no one remembers who, said, "And to Miss Shilling, whoever she is, God bless her." They drank and they laughed, and they did not know that the woman they were toasting was still alive, still working, still solving problems in a laboratory not 50 miles away. They did not know her face or her voice or the precise nature of her contributions, but they knew on some instinctive level that they owed her their lives. This is the truth that endures long after the gunfire has faded and the soldiers have come home and the historians have written their books. War is not won by grand strategies alone. It is won by the accumulation of small victories, small innovations, small acts of courage and cleverness. It is won by the mechanic who tightens a bolt correctly, by the pilot who keeps his nerve in a dive, by the engineer who refuses to accept that a problem is unsolvable, by the woman who walks into a room where she is not supposed to be, and designs a washer that saves 2,000 lives. History remembers the generals and the politicians, and rightly so. But it should also remember Beatrice Shilling. It should remember the 50-cent piece of metal that made the Spitfire unbeatable. It should be remembered that freedom is not just a political abstraction or a rhetorical flourish. It is a practical advantage. It is the ability to listen to anyone with a good idea, regardless of their gender, their background, or their place in the hierarchy. It is the ability to adapt, to improvise, to solve problems as they arise rather than waiting for permission from distant authorities. The Bf-109 was a magnificent aircraft, a testament to German engineering and precision, but it lost. It lost because the system that created it could not compete with the messy, chaotic, brilliant system that created the Spitfire. It lost because fascism, for all its surface efficiency, is fundamentally wasteful. It wastes talent. It wastes ideas. It wastes lives. And in the end, that waste is fatal. Beatrice Shilling's washer is now on display in the Royal Air Force Museum in London. It sits in a glass case, unremarkable and small, a circular piece of metal no larger than a coin. Most visitors walk past it without noticing. Those who do stop to read the placard might feel a flicker of curiosity, a moment of wonder that something so simple could have mattered so much. But the washer does not need their attention. It has already done its work. It has already saved the lives it was going to save. It has already proven the point it was meant to prove. And that point is this: in the struggle between freedom and tyranny, between adaptability and rigidity, between the open hand and the closed fist, it is often the smallest things that make the difference. A washer, a calculation, an idea. A woman who refused to be told what she could not do. These are the things that turn the tide. These are the things that win wars. These are the things that endure.